everybody. Welcome back to our show. I am very delighted to have Paul Graziano with us. Some call him Paul Revere. Why is he called Paul Revere? It's because he's been putting community boards and local civic organizations on high alert. His message is, the developers are coming. The developers are coming to tear down your homes and replace them with apartment houses. What is this alert about? It's a plan by our dear Mayor Adams to tear down small outer borough communities in order to allow the largest New York City developers to build high-rises in their place in the outer boroughs. In the name of right-sounding words, foster vibrant neighborhoods. Doesn't it sound beautiful? Relocate small businesses so they can be near their customers. Create gentle density and missing middle housing. Oh yes, build housing that is more affordable. Watch out, when you hear that word affordable, watch out. They are calling this zoning package the City of Yes. People listen to the bright sounding words. They don't think, what does it mean? They are blinded by its brightness. They only hear hope. They do not research into what has already happened when those bright sounding words have been put into effect. Today, Paul Graziano is going to help us find out what those bright sounding words actually mean. Missing middle housing.
Missing middle housing, that's an interesting one. So, in most other cities in the country, missing middle housing is three-family housing, 3 units. Just like they said, they want to make the baseline for the entire city 3 units, meaning the low-density areas, right? Missing middle housing in New York City is 3 to 5 story apartment buildings. So, this is specifically targeted at 1 and 2 family neighborhoods. What they're going to do is create what's called the transit-oriented development. Transit-oriented development will be all Long Island Railroad, Metro North, and subway lines within a ½ mile radius, so 1 mile in diameter. Any block that is touched by this zone, even if it's a foot, the entire block will be in the zone. And what this will allow is on qualifying sites, because they say, oh, this is very rare, it's not going to happen. Qualifying sites that are large lots, and the large lot is defined as 5,000 square feet, which is very small. An apartment building will be allowed to be built as of right in 1 and 2 family zones and lower density multifamily zones that would normally have garden apartments or row houses or 3 or 4 family homes. This will encourage, for example, in my block, and I gave this as an example yesterday, I have 28 single-family homes on my block. The property at the corner is qualifying. That property will be allowed to have 15 units of housing where there's a 1-family home.
Could a developer take that property in order to build 15 units?
What do you mean take it?
In other words, a community betterment.
There's no eminent domain in this, but, you know, Chair Garodnick said something publicly pretty recently. If you zone it, they will build it. We have always found over the years that if you create the opportunity, it will happen.
That's right.
And the reason that where I live remains single family is because we have single family zoning. If you change the zoning, it will not be single family anymore. There's no question. And that goes for huge swaths of the city.
The developers will come and offer them X amount of money.
Yes, it's a matter of...
It goes.
Absolutely. And when one goes, the rest go.
Yes.
That's the thing, is that, you know, their argument is, well, prior to 1961, when the zoning resolution came into effect, this was allowed in low-density areas. And then it was prohibited after 1961. Well, it was prohibited because it was changing these areas radically. And now they want to bring, as I said, they're bringing back the 1916 zoning ordinance. We are in, they call the 1961 zoning ordinance outdated. They are bringing us back to the 1916 zoning ordinance, which is positively prehistoric. The build out for the current zoning, what I mean by the build out is, if every property in the city were built to its maximum potential, the build out, according to the zoning that we have, if we never touch the zoning, ever again, would be 16 to 20 million people could be accommodated. Today, we have 8.2 million people. 64 years ago, we had 8.1 million people. We've gone down, up, and down again. So we are at the same population, more or less, that we had in 1960. We have 800,000 additional units, housing units. You could build up to 16 to 20 million people, so double to more than double and a half of what we have now. The 1916 zoning ordinance that they want to put back on us accommodates 55 million people. 55 million people. This is what they are trying to bring us back to. This is crazy.
And no provision for sewers.
Nope.
No provision for water lines.
No infrastructure, no police, no fire, no schools. Nothing is included in this proposal. Nothing. And it won't be. This is a developer-created proposal to benefit developers and nobody else. Nobody
To
else.
maximize their profits.
Correct. And in the meantime, like I said, now on my block, let's say one building gets built with 15 units. I have 20 houses on my block. One house is 15 units. Half of the other houses become two families because the zoning will change. And all of them also have an ADU. So now, 10 houses become 20 units. 20 units become 30 units, plus 15 units, plus the remaining 9 units. So my 20 homes become 45 units or more, 45 to 50 units. It's a doubling to tripling of density everywhere. And in some cases, it's over 500% increase in density.
And they ask, why are the children not doing so well? Well, teachers can only, shall we say, teach well as they have smaller classrooms. The larger the number of students, the teachability declines.
Many of the people who sit on the City Planning Commission send their children to private school. I have an 8-year-old who just finished 2nd grade in public school.
Yes.
And I'm a public school child, and my parents were public school children, and their parents were public school children. And what we see is, along with all of this, again, build, no increases in educational funding, no increases for police and fire. In fact, the mayor has tried to cut all of the funding for all of these things. We have seen also 200,000 children leave the city of New York in the last 10 years. So we used to have 1.1 million kids. We have 900,000, and yet our schools are still incredibly overcrowded.
That's
How
right.
can that be?
A teacher can't give children individual attention.
That's correct. My kid is in a class of 32, and he just finished 2nd grade. And he's in the Gifted and Talented program. And he's with 31 other kids.
And if you're not in the Gifted and Talented program, you really need additional attention.
You betcha. Absolutely. And we're in one of the good schools, right? And what about all of the other folks who are struggling with educational attainment for their
Of
kids?
course, if you're in private school, your class is probably 15 children.
15 children, and you're able to pay $50,000 or $60,000 a year
That's
for that
right.
kid to go to school. Well, we can't do that. We're middle class, and this entire proposal is to destroy what is left of the middle class in New York City. It's that simple.
Housing that is more affordable. How is this determined? What does this mean, more affordable?
So we have something called affordable housing in New York City. This is a designated actual qualification for certain housing that's built. However, much of this housing is not affordable at all. Okay, so I want to define affordable housing versus something that the City Planning Commission is calling more affordable. Okay, more
It's a different
affordable.
classification.
Well, because it's not a classification at all, but it's what they're saying. So there is an actual definition of affordable housing. However, it's based on what's called AMI, which is a number of the general income levels in a particular geographical area. The problem is the AMI in the Bronx is mixed with Westchester. So the AMI is much higher, and the AMI in Queens is mixed with Nassau. So it's a similar situation. So the numbers are much higher than they should be in terms of affordability. So for example, I'll give you a great example. A decade ago, we had a mayor named Bill de Blasio. Some of you may remember him. I'm sure you remember him as well.
I remember him for the taking of the yards for a certain particular developer.
Correct. Okay, so Bill de Blasio pushed for something called zoning for quality and affordability and mandatory inclusionary housing. And this whole scheme was to say, we're going to rezone areas, and we'll rezone them for much higher density. We're going to force developers to build affordable housing. So they did their first pilot one in East New York. Now, for those of you who don't know East New York, it's a very poor community, has a lot of problems with very low income levels, right? So it took 5 years for the rezoning to happen. In that time, developers, knowing that it was going to be rezoned, started buying up all of the vacant land and other parcels that could be easily redeveloped. And the speculative value of the property went up 700%. The affordability quotient for a family of 4 in these units was $130,000 for a family of 4. Meanwhile, a family of 4 in that community was $41,000 a year. So that's the problem when you create affordable, permanently affordable housing. But who is it affordable to, right? It's affordable to maybe middle to upper middle income families. There's certainly room to build housing, permanent middle class housing. That's fine. But when you're talking about going to a place like East New York or Brownsville or the South Bronx, or places that really need real affordable housing, and you're coming up with this, which is also, by the way, displacing other people, because all of those other places, as these areas gentrify, the other units are not controlled, or the other units controlled by landlords in those cases. They try to get out the low-income people and, quote-unquote, repair those units to increase the rents for higher renters. It's a normal thing to do, but by doing this, it sets off an avalanche of problems, which then leads to an increase in homelessness for families in the city. So it's a terrible situation. That's the actual affordable piece. The more affordable line is that if we build all of these transit-oriented development, 3 to 5 story buildings, town center zoning, which would allow 4-story buildings on commercial strips, residential, ADUs, accessory dwelling units, none of these are affordable, but quote-unquote, they will be more affordable than market rate rentals, to which I say nonsense. They are market rate rentals. There is nothing more affordable about these units.
Nothing limits what the owner can charge.
Correct. We live in a capitalist society, and the only way you are able to change what the owner will, the market will bear, is by government actually calling out and saying, these are permanently affordable at a certain rate. This can only be for, whether it's public housing, this is going to be built on public land. If you don't put in those controls, no one is going to charge less than what they want to charge for a unit.
That they can get away with.
Or that they can get away with, right? Mm-hmm. So that's really what it comes down to. And what I've said to people is, we don't have a housing crisis in the city of New York. We have an affordability crisis. And that we do have. As I said, we have the same population as we did more or less with 800,000 more units. But we have an affordability crisis because the people who live here cannot afford the places that they're living, because the rent is too damn high, because there aren't controls, because the city and the state deregulated rent-stabilized apartments 20 years ago, and we have lost hundreds of thousands of rent-stabilized apartments. We have tens of thousands of units off the market by landlords Some because they don't want to rent out because the new tenant laws are very difficult to throw out bad tenants, which I understand, but some because they just are hoarding the spaces to drive up rents, right? And you have NYCHA, which has thousands and thousands of units that are vacant, with a $12 billion backlog in maintenance for NYCHA housing. So you have units that can't be lived in NYCHA that could, if they were repaired, could easily have thousands of families.
I understand that under this new, shall we say, these new rules, that the developers go in and they can repair these apartments, and because they can repair their house, they can sweep these tenants out.
Correct.
So they can repair them.
Well, one of the big ones, and this has been going on now for 70 years, is let's even say 50 years, because that's a better benchmark. Many people in Manhattan will remember what Manhattan was like in the 60s and 70s. For those of people who are from Manhattan or from the city, places like the Upper West Side had brownstones that were divided into 20 units. They were not one-family homes like they were when they were built in 1890. They had been converted into small one-bedroom or two-bedroom apartments. Since the beginning of the 1961 zoning resolution, the one way that a landlord could convert that building and get rid of those tenants was the rent-stabilized tenants, was to convert it back to single-family use. So there are tens of thousands of units that were swept away that were affordable housing on the Upper West Side and in other parts of the city because very wealthy people purchased these buildings and legally removed the tenants because they converted the building back to single-family use.
Interesting.
Correct. Again, not a bad thing per se, meaning the law, because the idea is it's for your personal use. But on the other hand, that in all reality got rid of thousands and thousands of real affordable units.
And there used to be a deal where if a developer bought a building, he had to find housing at the same rental level for the people that were removed.
Yeah, I mean, that was, there are some situations where that still exists, but again, those are more exception than the rule, but the basic statement is that starting about 25 years ago, there's been a real push to deregulate everything. And now in the last decade, with groups like Open New York and Open Plans and YIMBY, which means yes in my backyard, these groups have been pushing to completely deregulate all land use to allow as much development as possible everywhere. And again, market rate, not affordable housing. They were out in force at this hearing yesterday. Out in force. We need to build more. We need more housing. We need more market rate housing. We're at a deficit of market rate housing. We just built, in the first quarter of this year, YIMBY, look at their website, YIMBY, New York YIMBY, reported that there were a record number of units filed to be built in the city of New York. Over 19,000 units of housing just for the first 3 months of this year. We have so much housing coming online in the next 2 years from permits that were received. It's crazy. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of units are going to be built within the next 3 to 4 years from the permits that have been filed.
Where have most of these permits been filed? What areas?
All over the city.
Mm-hmm.
All over the city.
And is there a public taking of what exists in these areas?
Well, when you say public taking, what do you mean?
What's the word? In other words, for community betterment, in the name of community
Well, all of this is in the name of progress, quote unquote.
There was a word you used.
A word that I used.
For community, in other words, it's legal to take a building if it upgrades the community.
Well, eminent domain.
That's the word.
Okay, eminent domain is a different thing. That's actually a government taking of your property.
Uh-huh.
And it has to be for a public use.
Okay, it's government taking, not private.
Right. So in other words, Robert Moses was famous for this. When he ran this city for 40 years without ever being elected. When he wanted to build the public housing, he used eminent domain to take all of that property away from private property owners and then turn it into government land, and then they built
A bridge.
They built, well, and also for bridges
And
and for roads and for highways and everything. Yes, that's all through eminent domain.
Okay.
So what has to happen is the government has to give what's called a fair market value. However, it's determined by judges as to what that property is worth. There have been instances where people have fought this and stopped it from happening, but it is a government thing. It has to do with government. Now, oftentimes, the government will say, we're going to do this, and hand it over once they take it and give it to a private developer. They did that in New London, Connecticut. It was a very famous Supreme Court case from 20 years ago where it was, I don't want to say it was IKEA, but it was one of the big, maybe it was Target, I forget what it is, but it's called the Kelo decision. It's a really important decision where the Supreme Court agreed that it was perfectly fine for government to take private property and then hand it over to another private group if it's for a public purpose, even if it's for private profit.
How about the Atlantic Yards?
Well, Atlantic Yards is a great example. Now that's a state, no, that was a state urban renewal area. De Blasio had very little to do with that.
Okay.
That is a state urban renewal area that started under, gosh, Patterson? No. Elliott Spitzer? It's a long time ago that started. But my point is that was done through a state urban renewal. They actually declared it an urban renewal area in the 1960s. It's not something new, but they finally got it together 25 years ago is when it all came together. So that's what that is.
Okay. Massive increase in as of right development in New York City. What is as of right?
So the way that our city is set up, if you want to build something, and you meet all of the basic rules for your zoning, and you meet all of the basic rules for your building code, you can go to the buildings department, file a permit, pay the fee, and get an approval to build your building. That's as of right. Most places in the United States do not have as of right development. New York City is one of the few places that has as of right development. Because again, the system is built for builders, by builders, right? So when you have as of right development, like I said, there is no additional permitting process. Landmark districts, we are sitting in a landmark district right now, you have to go to the Landmarks Commission if you want to do anything that's going to change the exterior of your building. You can do whatever you want on the interior, but anything that is in the public interest, which is the exterior of the building, has to go through additional review at the Landmarks Commission. Same thing with special districts. Let's see, what's a special district? The theater district is considered a special zoning district. The flower district is another special district. The garment district. These are all actual zoning districts that have very specific rules. We have them in Queens too. Fresh Meadows and Sunnyside Gardens are two special zoning districts. So if you meet the basic tenets, you get those permits. If you live in Scarsdale, or you live in Yonkers, or you live in the village of the city of Glen Cove, or the village of Manhasset, or one of these places in Long Island, you have to go to the planning board. You have to bring your plans. There's public hearings. The public comes out and says yes, no, whatever, and the planning board and the council or the town board have to approve it. Here, none of that. This city of yes will increase as of right development exponentially.
Repeat, what is it? What's the process?
The process is, I own a piece of property, I want to build something, I meet the basic requirements of the zoning and the building code, the buildings department approves, they say, yes, you do meet the zoning, yes, your building meets all of its requirements, it gives me a permit and I start to build. Now, currently, if a developer said, in my neighborhood, I want to build a 5-story apartment building, well, that's a change of zoning, right? Because right now you can only build a single-family home. So you have that change of zoning. That is not as of right. he would have to go through a zoning change. It's called the ULURP process, Uniform Land Use Review Procedure. And this is what guides all zoning in the city of New York, the zoning resolution. I don't want to have your eyes glaze over, but this is important because he would need to change the zoning from, let's say, my current zoning, which is R2A. He'd have to change it to an R5 zone or something like that, which allows apartment buildings. If he wanted to do that, he'd have to go to the community boards and the borough president and the city planning commission and the city council. So it's a whole process, political and methodical process as to why this should be or not allowed. That's not as of right.
But with this new plan that's been passed,
Well, it hasn't been passed.
hasn't it?
The hearing was yesterday.
Okay.
Yes, they're going to vote on this at the city council in October or November. So we're not there yet. Yesterday was the hearing at the city planning commission.
November.
October, November at the city council, which is where the real action is going to be. That's where it's going to happen. So yes, if this goes through, then a builder will be able to say, oh, well, that property is in the transit zone. All I have to do is buy the property, file my permits, and I can build this, in my case, a 3-story apartment building with 15 units, where there's a 1-family home right now.
I have to thank you so much for coming on my show, and you really have educated the general public.
Thank you.
This is Speak Up. This is Sandra Shelby. Till next time, goodbye.